One complex behavior that we all engage in is the use of language. And today we're going to talk about language. We'll deal with what the properties of language are, how we develop language, and something about how language is dealt with in the brain, and finally a little bit on, is language something that only humans have, or is it shared with other non-human animals? Okay, there's basically 6 properties of language that all languages have. The first, it's communicative. We use language to interact with each other in our society. It's arbitrary, except for a very few things called onomatopoeia, like, for example, hiss is a sound that actually describes what it is we are talking about, what a snake does when it uses sound. But it's arbitrary for most things. It's symbolic, which means it represents something. It's also meaningfully structured. We have grammar and syntax, which helps us understand and use language. It's creative in the sense that we make sentences all the time that we've never heard before or never made before. In fact, when I start this sentence, I'm not even sure how it's going to end. So it's very productive or creative. And it's dynamic. We add words to our vocabulary all the time. In fact, we add words to everybody's vocabulary as things happen and creates new ways of symbolically representing things that didn't exist in the past. Communicative, arbitrary, meaningfully structured, creative, and dynamic. The properties of every language. Now, when you look at a language, it has certain components to it. First, it's made of sounds when I'm talking and you are listening and understanding. And those are called phonemes. And those phonemes are, in fact, the different kinds of sounds that we make. And there are about 200 in all languages. And then there are morphemes, which are the smallest unit in a language that actually represents something that has meaning. And then we have words. So, for example, phonemes, if I have a sentence that says it takes time and effort to learn a second language, the phonemes would be I and T, making up it, and then T, A, K, and then because it's plural, there's another S, there's another morpheme other than take, which is the plural, which makes takes, and the word is takes. And you can sort of divide up language with these components. Phonemes, morphemes, words, phrases, like a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and then sentences. Now, how do we acquire language? Well, there are 2 basic views. There's a behaviorist view, which says, in Skinner's book was called Verbal Behavior, which says language is learned. And of course, language is learned to some extent. But people like Noam Chomsky, in his book Language and the Mind, believe there was an innate human predisposition to acquire language because all humans use language. And he said, so built into the genes is a language acquisition device, an LAD. You can learn language because we're genetically predisposed to learn it. This is supported by the fact that there's a critical period for learning language. Johnson and Newport studied people that came into this country from ages 3 to 19 and and then 10 years after they immigrated into the United States, they gave a test of complex grammar. And as you can see, if they entered between 3 and 7, they looked just like native language speakers in this test of grammar 10 years later. But then, if they came in later than 7, their performance on the language tests, on the grammar tests, declined dramatically depending upon what their age was when they entered. So it's not the length of time that you're using the language, it's when you first started using the language, that is, how much of the earlier language were you using, and that's what this critical period is. And this is one argument against the idea that it's just behavioristic, because you have this period of time very early in life where you can learn language easily. In fact, Noam Chomsky said that by the time a person is 4 years old, they already have the complex adult language learned. Well, I took 4 years of German in college, and believe it, I can't use the language hardly at all. So I needed to be much, much younger if I wanted to learn that language. Now, language acquisition in this first 4 years is, first we know that even prenatally, before an infant is born, they can respond to human voices. They respond differently to human voices in the womb than they do to other sounds. Then there's prenatal cooing in the first 4 months, where they simply are using all the phonemes, all the phonemes, all the basic units of language. And then starting later, there's babbling, where they start narrowing down the phonemes to those phonemes that are used in that language. Because different languages use a different set of phonemes. This is why we have dialects, because you're using phonemes in the second language that you hadn't babbled in the first language when you had the first language. And then after babbling, we have the first word. It tends to be a frontal consonant, something that you do with the front of your mouth followed by a vowel. Things like, I called my mother Baba. My grandmother I call Gaga. My grandkids call me Gigi. So we tend to use those very first words in identifying with people that we're around a lot. Then we have sort of holophrases. These are words that really are identification, like Baba or Gaga. And sometimes you have overextensions, because I might say Dada for my father, but then every male becomes Dada, or every animal becomes Dada, even though that was originally used to identify my dog. But then we start having multi-word phrases or telegraphic speech, like want cookie, 2-word phrases that actually have meaning to it. And then between 2 and 3, we really develop vocabulary. At age 2, it's usually about 300 words. And at age 2, it's 300 words. And age 3, it's up to 1,000 words. So very quickly, we're acquiring a vocabulary of words. And then at age 4, we have adult sentence structure. So very quickly, we learn the basic grammatical structure of language. Now, let's talk a little bit about brain and language. The language center is located for most people in the left hemisphere, and it's weakly associated with your handiness, but only weakly. For example, if you're strongly right-handed, almost everybody has in the left hemisphere. If you're ambidextrous, it reduces it to 85%, meaning 15% have it in the right hemisphere. And even if you're strongly left-handed, almost 3/4 of the people have it in the left hemisphere. So it's not a bilateral kind of thing. Language is located in one hemisphere or the other, and for most people, it's in the left hemisphere. There are some spatial abilities that are located in the right hemisphere, so these are asymmetrical. Now, there are 2 areas in the brain, and where you would expect them to be, that deal with language. There's Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, very close to the motor cortex. There's the motor cortex. If you remember the homunculus that we spread out across the cortex, there was a very large area in this end of the motor cortex that dealt with the mouth and the tongue. And these are areas that are associated heavily with language. We use the tongue and the mouth in the larynx to create language sounds. And the Broca's area is very heavily associated with that. And there's also Wernicke's area, which is in the temporal area of the brain, very close to the auditory cortex. And so we speak and we listen and we understand, and we have to use the auditory cortex. Now, we know these areas exist because of people that have lesions. And when they have lesions in either Broca's areas or Wernicke's area, it creates something called aphasia or dysphagia. These words are used synonymously. Really, dysphagia is a better word, but aphasia is the word that's more commonly used. If the lesion in the brain is in Broca's area, people have a difficulty in producing speech. If the lesion is in Wernicke's area, they have They're fluent, they can produce speech, but it doesn't make any sense most of the time. And they certainly can't comprehend sounds coming in easily because of lesions in the area that actually receives those sounds and interprets them. In your readings, it has a film which demonstrates both an aphasic person with Broca's area lesions and one with Wernicke's area lesions, and you can really detect the differences very clearly. So now we want to ask the question, are humans the only animals that can use language, or can non-human animals use language? Without a doubt, animals have a very strong communication ability. For example, even a honeybee has a dance that it does when it comes back into the hive after getting pollen from the flowers, and the honeybee dances and tells other bees where the flowers are. There are certain monkeys that have very different calls for different predators. For example, they might have one call if the predator is a snake out there in the wild. It might have another one if it's a leopard, and have another one for other predators. Very different, and we can identify what they are. Most of the work, experimental work, has been done with chimps. First, psychologists tried to actually live with chimps from when they were infants to see if they could acquire language, but they don't really have the vocal apparatus to do that. And there are other people that have actually used American Sign Language, that is, they teach sign language, and they were able to develop a very large vocabulary of items, so representing things out in the environment. And then the very sophisticated work with Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, who used lexicograms, that is, a symbol in an array of keys, and the animal could press a key to represent those symbols. Hundreds and hundreds of different symbols that represent lexicograms. So if we look at the evidence, are there language use by other organisms other than humans? It really depends upon your definition of language. If you say that language is the ability to communicate through sequence of symbols, the answer is clearly yes. But if you say a symbolic expression of complex grammar, then the evidence is not clear. They can come up with phrases like, you give me candy, or it might say, candy you give me, or me give you candy. It's just the grammar is sort of arbitrary in most of these representations. There are some evidence of that, especially with Sue Savage-Rumbaugh's work, but it seems to be not as strong as you would get with a 4-year-old child. So when we go back to the first slide, which says the 6 properties of language, what do non-humans show? Well, they clearly are communicative. They clearly are using sounds to represent things out there in the environment. They are arbitrary. They're something which really doesn't represent the actual thing, represents the actual thing, but isn't equal to it. The question is whether it's meaningfully structured. Do we have grammar or do we not have grammar? And whether it's creative. There is some sort of anecdotal evidence that it's creative. For example, some of the chimpanzees would do things like when they saw a doll, which is Pinocchio doll with a long nose, they might say elephant doll. So that's pretty creative. But it seems to be anecdotal, not very strong evidence for it. So whether it's meaningfully structured is doubtful, and whether it's creative is debated and typically used by anecdote. And it is dynamic. They can learn new symbols. So it's up to you whether it's language or it's not language. But I think most people say the debate is still out there and it's still controversial. And humans might in fact be the only animal that uses language as we define it. Thank you.